content that we'll be going through today is related to free trade and protection. So we'll go through that, and then we'll go through some tips and tricks on how to achieve success in economics and what to do to be able to achieve good marks in the subject. So let's get started with free trade and protection. I know it's quite a long lecture, but hopefully you're all still with me. We're almost approaching the end of the lecture, so yeah, not too long to go now. Alright, so let's start off with Australia's free trade policies. So first of all, we want to basically figure out what protection is. Protection is a type of government action, whether that be tariffs, quotas, subsidies, that have an effect on giving domestic producers an artificial advantage over foreign competitors. Okay, so essentially you're protecting your local businesses so that when foreign competitors come into Australia and they compete with the local businesses, that local businesses have an artificial advantage, right? So when asked like why do we actually need protection? What is the justification of this artificial advantage? Some things include protection of infant industries, so new industries that are just starting out, protection of employment during a recession. So making, these local businesses are obviously hiring a lot of employees, so making sure those employees are stay employed essentially during recessions and downfalls in the international business cycle. Protection from dumping of imports into the domestic market below factor or production cost. So essentially, we're trying to prevent dumping, which is where, like let's say there's an overproduction of a certain good, they will then dump it at a very, very cheap price, which will impact negatively on local businesses who are making that same product, because then businesses will just go to that like foreign competitor who's selling it at a very cheap price, but it's really not sustainable. Then we've got improvement in terms of trade. So if the exporting country reduces its price for another country's imports. And finally, reducing the balance of payments or the current account deficit. So if protection causes less spending on imports. Okay, so some things to have a think about. The reason that I haven't gone into these in as much detail is because they were covered in topic 1. So please go ahead and revise topic 1 if you're still quite unsure or you've forgotten about these. Your textbook or your notes, etc. Like have a look through them. This is quite a simple concept. Just having like sort of a brief recap on what it is would be beneficial to you for this topic as well. All right, so moving on to free trade. So reducing trade barriers to, what is free trade? Essentially, you're reducing trade barriers, you're allowing trade to occur more naturally, and it's sort of a more open and communicative thing that takes place. So encouraging countries to specialize in the production of the good and service that they are most efficient in producing. So this improves resource allocation. If we go back to prelims, remember what the idea of economics is, right? The economic problem is essentially we've got unlimited wants, but we've only got limited resources. So we need to allocate those limited resources to meet the wants that we most want to meet, right? So resource allocation is extremely important. So when we focus on our comparative advantage, like I talked about at the very start of this lecture, how Australia's comparative advantage relates around our commodities and our services, as well as our agricultural products, those things are what we're good at. So we're not going to go and produce, for example, technology, cars, petroleum, whatever, right? And we're just going to focus on those, and then we're going to get the rest of the things that we don't really have a comparative advantage in, and we're going to get that imported into the country. So specialization through economies of scale, as it lowers the cost and improves productivity, which is great for the economy and as well as businesses, right? So businesses lowering cost will increase profits, and what higher profits mean is more revenue for the government because they pay more taxes. Encourages innovation and spread of new technology as well, and it leads to higher living standards due to lower prices, which cause an increase in economic growth and provides greater consumer choice, right? So consumers have more choice now rather than just having one local business that they get their products from. They have a range of different businesses, including local and foreign businesses as well. All right, so trends. The Australian government, over approximately the last 30 years, has removed many protection barriers, giving basically that were given to Australian industries and manufacturers. And so now those protection barriers are gone. So there's no real artificial advantage that is prominent in the economy for local producers. In 1973, for example, 25% across the board unilateral reduction of protectionist policies by the Whitlam government. There's also aimed to promote structural change to increase efficiency, productivity, and competition. So that was something that was sort of encouraged during that time, and something that is still relevant today with globalization and free trade very prominent in the makeup and the structure of today's economy. Not only Australia's economy, but also globally across the world, free trade is having a greater impact, and it's playing a much bigger role. So decreasing the average tariff levels in Australia from 9% in 1995 to 1.2% in 2016. Right, so again, something important to note there, with tariffs being a form of protection, right? So there are tax on the foreign competitors that come in and want to sell their products. They have to pay a certain tax on top of their product, which is normally then passed on to consumers. So the volume of exports increased by 8.6%, and Australia's GDP increased by $4 billion. As a result of that. So we can see the huge role that free trade actually plays to Australia's economy and Australia's economic success as well. In saying that, does not necessarily mean that all protection has disappeared. For example, some subsidies still remain, which is like government funds basically to help local businesses. For example, Australian government subsidies to farmers to increase international competitiveness for the farmers, as food prices can be quite volatile, especially after events such as floods and other natural disasters. So that's something that they do to help. So, for example, Austrade provides financial assistance, technical and marketing advice, and EMDGs, which are essentially grants, which reimburse exporters for costs relating to promotion of exports into new markets. So that's an example of subsidies that are provided to local businesses to help them get out there and be internationally competitive. So it's not like Australia has completely gotten rid of protection in the economy. So each dollar spent generates about $13.50 for $27 worth of exports. All right, so having a look at some of the free trade agreements. So we've got bilateral agreements. So bilateral trade agreements is basically an agreement between two countries. So, for example, Australia has negotiated many free trade agreements with countries such as New Zealand, Thailand, Singapore, US, Chile, Korea, China, etc. So a range of different countries. We've got free trade agreements with a range of different countries. Bilateral agreements are effective in encouraging increased trade between two countries. So if it's between Australia and the US, just encouraging trade between those two countries becomes a lot easier because of that free trade agreement. So an advantage of a bilateral trade agreement is that they are completed and implemented quickly, because really you just need two signatures, right? So a disadvantage, however, is that it adds to complexity of international trade, because now there's really just that relationship between the two people. There's too many different trading relationships, which can be quite difficult to manage. So we'll go through some examples of bilateral trade agreements. The first one we have is China and Australia Free Trade Agreement. This was created in 2015 to promote free trade. So 86% of Australia's exports to China are tariff-free, and they intend to increase it to 98% in order to improve international competitiveness. There has, however, been a little bit of like a problem in recent times between China and Australia and their trading relationship, I guess at the back end or at the start of COVID. And so that's majorly impacted their trading relationship with, sort of China not buying, I think, barley and wheat and wine, I think it was, from Australia. And so there's been a bit of tension in terms of trade, which you can definitely do more research on. So Australia has granted greater market access for, education. So a lot of international students will come in from China to be educated in Australia. And so this means that China gains improved access to investment in Australia as well. However, many articles have noted that there's been major controversy in terms of Chinese companies bringing in migrant workers to work on major projects. So that's something to note as well. So I think it's quite important to take this into consideration and yeah, I guess just have a look into the relationship between Australia and China because they are Australia's major trading partner, right? They are the biggest trading partner of Australia, and so their role is quite important as well. So any tensions that do arise between the two countries can be extremely detrimental to both countries. Another example of a bilateral trade agreement that is quite prominent is the one between Australia and the US. This has been effective since 2005. It provides significant tariff reductions on goods in sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing. So automotive tariffs were eliminated completely, and tariffs on goods from 2013 were also eliminated. So the US is Australia's second largest trading partner after China and constitutes about 9.6% of Australia's two-way trade. So definitely provide updates in those stats as time progresses as well. All right, then we go into multilateral trade agreements. So this is rather than just having two countries, it's a range of different countries, like a bunch of different countries that sort of group together in order to improve free trade and achieve free trade between those countries and as a region. Normally, a lot of the time, it's based on geographic regions. So your location of where you are, like the Asia Pacific, for example, is looking at that specific geographic region. So this first one we've got is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So this is also referred to as APEC. This is a cooperative effort of 21 countries with a common goal of improving free trade in this region. So first established in 1989, APEC has facilitated and improved trade amongst its member countries. So essentially just helping free trade and so sort of trading goods has become a lot easier between them. So over 50% of the gross world product actually comes from member nations of APEC. So you can see that this is quite an important cooperation and free trade agreement. So you can definitely use your notes from topic 1 to help you out with this as well. So Asian is another one. This is the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. Sorry, should not say Asian. It's the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and ZAFTA is also another one. So currently, Australia's main free trade agreement. So actually, they are combined. Apologies. I'm getting confused. So Asian is a part of the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. So it's established in 2009, consists of 12 member nations. So the of the members basically accounting for 20% of Australia's total trade in goods and services, which is a huge chunk of Australia's total trade, right? So prior to 2010, only 67% of Australia's exports to NZAFTA members were tariff-free, so there was no tax on the imports. By 2020, 96% will be tariff-free as protection is reduced specifically on agriculture and pharmaceuticals, which are major exports for Australia. So there's a reduction in protection of export markets, which will boost the Australian economy by about $19 billion. So that's something important to note as well. So let's have a look at the implication of the Australian protectionist policies in terms of the three different levels. So we've got the individual level, and then we've got the firms level, and we've got the government level, and we'll talk about each one. So individually, structural unemployment in the short term, and import competing industries will occur. So we can see why, right? Because we've got free trade that's taking place. There will be a structural unemployment. So we need to restructure the industries, and we need to cut local production. For example, we went through that with the car industry, because now the car industry is very much not prominent in Australia. We don't really have a car industry in Australia as much anymore. Long term, however, erosions of skill principle, the idea that long term unemployed may increase, job opportunities will also increase, right? Because those industries that are very efficient and export competing, they will hire more people, and there's going to be a wider variety of goods and services for individuals to access as well. So lower prices, improved living standards, because now you have more options. You have the options of both going and buying from a local producer and a foreign producer. Then we move on to firms. So with firms, we've got short-term restructuring might be necessary, so forced innovation and competitiveness, shrink of import competing industries, so they cannot compete internationally. Those businesses will then close down, so that's going to impact firms. And there's also going to be a loss of profits in the short term, so whilst restructuring necessary. So long term, however, we see that things will improve. So basically higher overall competition and higher productivity, and this should say may lower. Let me just fix that. So it may lower import costs for other firms that use imported goods as well, right? So something to have a think about there. So please do consider noting these down, because again, you want to make sure that you consider long-term and short-term impacts, because these are often different. Something that happens immediately with short-term impacts will very quickly and drastically change to long-term impacts as well. So that's something to really take into consideration. And then finally, we've got government. So short-term, reduced government revenue due to decreased tariffs and tax collection. Right, so because remember that tariffs are reduced because they are a protectionist method and we're trying to encourage free trade. So those two ideologies clash, and because we're trying to encourage free trade, there will be less tariffs. So essentially that will mean less revenue for the government. The government spending may increase in subsidies to retrenched workers, and political consequences, right? So governments may lose votes by reducing protection, etc. So that may be a short-term impact to take into consideration as well. And in the long term, we've got sustainable economic growth. So this should raise revenue in the future as the economy becomes more efficient and can essentially become more efficient in the future as well. So although in the short term you're likely to face some consequences, we're likely to see an increase in efficiency in the long term, which is beneficial, which is an advantage of free trade in the economy. All right, and then we look at implications for other countries. So high domestic protection, like if Australia was very protective of their local businesses, then retaliation is going to occur from other international economies. So if we're very, very, very protective of our local businesses, then chances are when we go and try to export our products to another country, that country will also be very protective of their local businesses, making it hard for you to go and export as Australians to go and export in that country. So Australia has played an active role in the WTO, which is also known as the World Trade Organization, to achieve reductions in agricultural subsidies which distort agricultural prices. So EU farmers able to produce at a cheaper price, and they deny market access to efficient exporters like Australia. So that has caused quite a bit of an issue and quite a bit of a stir, which Australia has been sort of taking up with the WTO. So, protectionist policies such as tariffs on Australia's exports will help reduce sort of exports and lessen GDP of the Australian economy. So that's something to take into consideration, right? So do we really want that? And of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to both to having protectionist policies and to not having protectionist policies and encouraging free trade. Now, these are two conflicting and two competing ideas that we need to make sure that we weigh up our positives and our negatives, our advantages and our disadvantages, and go from there.